welcome to Historical Context with a Historian. This episode is going to be about terminology. Now you will notice that throughout this book, the author, Jerry West, uses the word Indian to refer to the Native American people, specifically the Yumatans in this book, which is a fictional Pueblo tribe that he created for the story. And today, this is not really a word that is preferred by a lot of people. Today, you're much more likely to hear Native American. That's considered a more respectful term. But in the 1950s, when this book was published, Indian was really the term that you would hear. This was a respectful term at the time. It was what people used. It was what they used for themselves. And so in the 1950s, when this was written, it would have been a perfectly respectful way to refer to them, which is why I have gone ahead and read it using that word throughout, because that would have been typical of the 1950s. That would have been respectful. There would have been no offense intended, certainly, and there would have been none taken in all probability. I think that the Hollisters' behavior demonstrates that if someone had told them to call them something else, they would have done that. And this was the term that was very commonly used in the 1950s. That's pretty much what it was. It would have been regarded as a perfectly respectful term. Today, that's changed, and this is something that happens. The specific respectful terminology sometimes changes for different groups, and that has happened over the last 70 years. The term Indian is not really insulting, at least most of the time. Some people do find it offensive, a lot don't, but it is not generally the most preferred term. And part of that is because it's a misnomer. Obviously, there's nothing to do with India. So where did the term Indian for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, where did that even come from? Well, it came originally from Christopher Columbus. Now, you may have heard that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 because two things. He was trying to explore the world, and he was trying to prove that the world was not flat. Both of these are untrue. He was not trying to do either one of those things. First of all, educated people had known for thousands of years that the world was not flat. There was not this widespread belief that the world was flat in the 1400s. In fact, thousands of years prior, a classical Greek mathematician by the name of Eratosthenes had not only known that the world was a sphere, but had actually calculated its circumference, how big around it was. And he did this by having two monuments that were a specific distance apart. He knew how far apart they were. He knew how tall they were. He measured their shadows, and he did all the math from that, and he came up with the circumference of the Earth. And he was really close. He was within a couple hundred miles of getting it perfect. So people had known for thousands of years that the world was a sphere. There was not a widespread belief that the world was flat. People had seen ships go over the horizon and come back. So this was not what Columbus was doing. People knew that the world was not flat. He also wasn't trying to discover new lands. He was trying to get to Asia. He was trying to get to East and Southeast Asia, China, India, Indonesia, places like that. And the reason he wanted to do that was for trade. Those places, which were called at that time the Indies, were the source of incredibly valuable trade goods. Silk, porcelain, spices, things like that were worth huge amounts of money in Europe. And so every European power wanted to have a direct line to that stuff so they could make the money. But it was really difficult because it was the other side of the world. You had to travel. If you wanted to do it by sailing, you had to go around the southern tip of Africa, which is a very stormy region. Lots of ships sank there. And then you had to sail north again. It was this huge thing. It took years to do. It was a massive hassle. It was expensive. These ships sometimes went down. And so it was kind of imperative for the Western European powers to come up with a better way to get to the Indies. And that is what Columbus was trying to do. He figured, okay, the world is a sphere, which everybody knew. What if we just, instead of going all around and going east, what if instead we just set out into the Atlantic and went straight ahead? And because the world is a sphere, we'll go all the way around and we will hit Asia. So it'll be much simpler, we just go straight ahead. Now, credit due, that is a relatively logical plan. Now, he didn't have anywhere near as good an idea of the size of the Earth as Eratosthenes had hundreds of years before. He thought the world was about half the size that it was. In fact, he expected to hit Indonesia round about where Memphis, Tennessee is. So he didn't expect there to be a honking great huge couple of continents in the way. But that was his idea. Sail west and get to Asia that way. That's what he was trying to do. That was the goal. And he landed in the Caribbean, and when he landed there, he thought he'd hit India, because that's where he was aiming for. He thought he'd hit India. And so the people who lived there had darker skin than he did. They had dark hair. He thought they looked kind of like what people from India he would expect to look like. And so he figured they were Indians because he thought he was in India. And so he called them Indians. Now, everyone else pretty quickly realized you didn't hit Asia. This is something else. But the name stuck. And so the term Indian for the indigenous peoples of the Americas has stuck around and is still used, even though it doesn't really make sense. And all the way through the 50s, the 60s, basically when the civil rights movement hit in the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s even, the term Indian people started to criticize it. People started to think, that's probably not a great thing to call people. In 1953, when this book was published, people wouldn't have thought twice. It would have been used and taken as perfectly respectful. But today, it's a little more iffy. Now, there are terms that are outright insulting, that are slurs, that should not ever be used. For example, and I'm going to use it here. Don't use it. It's not good. But so you'll know what I'm talking about. The pro football team, the Washington football team is what it's called now. For many years, it was called the Washington Redskins. And there had always been controversy because that is a slur. That is a racial slur. It should not be used. And it certainly should not be attached to a pro football team. And there had been controversy about it for many years. And finally, just recently, the owner of the team agreed to actually change the name. And so it's now called the Washington Football Team. I'm not sure that they've finalized what they're going to call it after that. But that is a slur that should not be used. The word Indian is a little less so. It's a little more kind of gray area. But it also depends on what people want to be called. Some people prefer the term Native American. Some prefer indigenous American is a term that some people like better. Some people like to just be called native because obviously America didn't, that came from the Europeans. America is actually named after the Italian map maker Amerigo Vespucci. And so obviously it wasn't America prior to the Europeans coming along, and so just native is what is preferred. Some people actually prefer American Indian instead of any other option. So there are a lot of different ones, and the best plan is, if you possibly can, the top goal, the most respectful thing to do is to call a person by their tribal or national affiliation. So instead of calling someone a Native American or an American Indian or an indigenous American or whatever it might be. Instead of that, if you possibly can, call them Navajo or Comanche or Algonquin or Inuit, their tribal or national affiliation, because obviously Native American culture is not really a thing. It's many dozens and dozens of different cultures with different languages and different beliefs and different traditions and completely different ways of living. And so even talking about Native Americans as sort of a unified group is a little bit silly. So if you possibly can, the most respectful option is to call a person by their tribal affiliation or national affiliation. If you don't know that, Native American is usually a safe bet. If someone tells you, don't call me that, call me this, do that. This is a matter of respect. If you get it wrong, be respectful, correct it. People have different preferences. Call people what they want to be called. But that is the history of the term Indian when it refers to indigenous or Native Americans. That's where it came from. It actually came from Columbus mistaking where he was. And it just kind of stuck. Additionally, obviously the term Native American or indigenous American or whatever specifically refers to America. It's a different matter in Latin America, which is Spanish speaking for the most part. It's a different matter in Canada. It's even a different matter in parts of America. For example, Alaska, most often the people wish to be called Alaskan Native or Native Alaskan instead of Native American. In Canada, most often the term is First Nations to reflect the idea that they were there first and that they were nations, that they were organized bodies of people. And so there are many different terms kind of floating around. It can be very confusing. I may have gotten it wrong, partly in this video. This is a place where the golden rule is very helpful. Do what you would want someone to do to you. So use the most respectful term that you know, and if someone tells you that you've got it wrong, change what you're doing. This is something that is, in terms of terminology, it's a little more complicated than it was in the 1950s. A lot of that has to do with awareness. People not really thinking so much about the issue. But this is something that is important for us to try to do our best. And if we mess up, to do our best to correct it.